All right, welcome. Today I'll be talking to you about these methods that you're using in psychology because we need to do research to back up our claims. So the first idea that I want to talk about is about common sense, experience, intuition versus psychological science. So why can't we just trust our own experience, common sense, intuition? Why isn't that good enough? If you're asking, what are some examples of common sense? Some examples would be like that saying, money can't buy happiness. Playing hard makes you more attractive. You can't teach an old dog new tricks. So there's just kind of like these phrases that we might hear from time to time where they're just things that have always been said. And sometimes when we say those things, it kind of makes us automatically have bias or assumptions. So those are some examples of common sense. So the next thing is an opinion. So what is an opinion? An opinion would be something that's not based off of fact, that is not always true all the time. It kind of comes from our belief and what we think is true. So one opinion would be out of, infinite examples would be people are more likely to follow the rules if there's a penalty for not following them. So that's an opinion. Um, and that might be true sometimes, but there are some times when that isn't true, but people can have that opinion. So it's not based off of a fact. It's just someone's belief. Another one would be introducing a small fee for picking up one's children late from daycare will be effective in getting parents to pick up their children on time. So do we agree or not agree? So this is not necessarily based off a fact. We could possibly gather some information and some data to prove either way, but it does start with an opinion. So there was a research study that did look at this by Muzi and Rashini in Israel. So there was a research study where 10 daycare centers had volunteered for a study and were randomly assigned to either implement a small fine, so about $2.50, if the parents were at least 10 minutes late picking up their children, or there was a group that of daycare centers that did not implement the fine. And then after 20 weeks, they introduced a fine at week 5. So let's take a look at the data. So as you'll see, if you look at the graph, we have on the x-axis or the horizontal line, the number of weeks or the time. And then on the left side, we have our y-axis, and that's the amount of late arrivals. And then our bold is the group. We have two groups here. We have our group that has there's a fine that's implemented, and then a control group where there's no fine at all. So just take a look and see what do you notice? So if you're taking a look at this, maybe one thing you notice is that there is an increase of light arrivals after the fine has been implemented. So I think the fine was implemented at week 5, which I see here, and late arrivals increase from about 10 on average to 20. Peaks at 20 and then kind of averages out around, I think that's maybe 16, 17, around there. So as you can see, compared to our control group, which remains pretty consistent over time, for some reason late arrivals increase. So I'm just wondering, like, what is your theory? What do you think this happened? And does that align with our statement before that if we implement a penalty, it is more likely to change the behavior of a group or person? So some ideas that we have to think about when we're discussing research methods is like, why are we doing it in the first place? The reason we're doing it is because we want to make sure that we're not basing things just on opinions and that we're too confident about some common sense opinions that are out there. So one problem with basing our beliefs on intuitions is that when we're extremely confident in our ideas, they can still be wrong. So for example, we might be extremely confident that the center lines in the diagrams differ in length when in fact they're the same. So we have to be really careful about being overconfident in our opinions. Because if we base our beliefs on intuitions, even though we're extremely confident in our ideas, they can still be wrong. And as you see in this example, our initial thought of, okay, if we implement a penalty, there's going to be a change in behavior where there's kind of where there is the opposite effect. And we have to think about that and why that's happening. So if we're going to be scientists and psychologists, we need to be using the scientific method. So that will determine the claims that we make are not just opinions or common sense. We can actually prove them with evidence. And there's a certain process for that. So, like I said, as empiricists, psychologists base their beliefs on systematic and objective observations of the world. And this approach is about grounding our confidence in ideas through direct and systematic research. So, what does it mean to say scientific? So, like I had mentioned, psychologists are empiricists, meaning they base their belief on systematic, objective observations of the world. And the scientific method, which you've probably heard before when you've taken like chemistry or biology class or something like that, is that when we're running experiments and we're doing observations of the world, we need to base one's confidence in the idea of these direct ways to gather information. And that's research. And this could be organized in something called a theory data cycle. And this is just this ongoing cycle that you go through over and over again to strengthen your claims. In general, the process of the scientific method in which scientists collect data can either confirm or disconfirm our theories. And so a theory is a set of propositions explaining how and why people think, act, or feel. And when we make that theory or have a theory about something in the world, we can generate a hypothesis. So I believe that maybe again, like you've seen like in a science class, is that you have to generate a hypothesis. And hypothesis is a specific prediction stating what will happen in the study if a theory is correct. So if this happens, if this situation happens, or this behavior happens, or this person has this characteristics, then I believe this will be the result. And then, so how do we strengthen or how do we prove that hypothesis is false or true? We have to gather data, and that's a set of empirical observations that scientists gather. So first it starts with our theory, then we ask questions. Asking good questions is really important part of the process. And then design kind of what is going to be our design for research? How are we going to formulate the way we gather information, the way we show results, and we're going to make a claim or hypothesis and gather the data. And this is an ongoing cycle over and over again. So some things to think about or ask when you're going through this cycle is, well, you're going to be asking a lot of things, but the first thing is what happens when the data does not support a theory? So we might be really confident in a theory, and this is the importance of one of the important things about doing research is that you might be so confident that something is true. One of the things about that is we have to also accept that our data that we gather doesn't always support our theory. And then what happens when it does, and is one study enough? So those are just things to think about, or I want you to think about while we're talking about this process. So what happens when the data doesn't support the theory we're so confident in? What happens when it does? And ask yourself, is one study enough for looking at a certain question or hypothesis that you have? So maybe going back to what I had talked about before, the example that I brought up was the daycare centers and how the theory was that if parents are given a fine or if there's some kind of negative consequence that happens, then that would reduce the behavior of late pickup. And so in this instance, it was a fine. So the researchers believe that if a fine is implemented, then therefore parents would decrease their late picking up behavior. Another thing to think about is replication. This kind of answers one of our questions that we just had, is one study is not enough. So you might hear me mention certain studies throughout these slides, and you'll be hearing this throughout your college career, is that we'll cite some kind of study that, Smith, 2020, had mentioned this or had studied this and blah, blah, blah. And the reason why there's power behind those different sources or the citations is because so many people cite them and so many other researchers have replicated the study in some way. and that strengthens that source. So more than a single study is necessary to build confidence in a theory. They have to go through this process over and over again. And replication is important because when a study is conducted more than once, a new sample of participants and obtains the same basic results, then we can start to confirm, okay, even with different populations, even tweaking the environment, even tweaking these variables, we still get the same results. So it kind of goes back to some questions. We can ask him some more questions. What happens if the results of the second study don't agree with the first study? So what do you think happens? And then are two studies enough? So I had mentioned that one study is not enough, but are two studies enough? So publishing is really important in this process too. And researchers will typically be there'll be professors at universities. There'll be students like yourselves. There are also private entities and organizations that do research. So once they conduct these studies, they will write about it. They want to share their information with the world. And that's the process, is that once the results are gathered, once we write up what we did, we write about the process, we write about everything about the study, write about the participants, all of that, we have to publish it. And it allows, so what is the point of publishing? There's a lot of different reasons why you want to publish, and there's different ways you can publish. But it allows the broader scientific community to review, critique, and build upon the work, upon those theories, and create new knowledge. And articles that are created, that are written, are usually peer-reviewed and published in journals dedicated to specific academic disciplines. So there'll be different journals for different areas. Like there'll be journals for education, for special education, which is the area that I'm in. There'll be journals for economics, for biology and chemistry. So you'll from time to time hear about these journals. And the more we publish, the more new knowledge we can generate. And just going back to that peer reviewed, what is peer reviewed? Peer reviewed is when we write an article and then we have to get people to look at it to kind of test or scrutinize the process and give us critiques about our process. And that makes our writing, it makes our results stronger if we're able to have that critique instead of just someone just like anybody can just write something and publish it. But if it's peer reviewed, then we know that went through like a strict process to be published. So some questions to think about is, I kind of answered some of these already, but why is it important to publish your findings regardless of statistical significance? So that's the idea of, okay, what if you didn't find exactly what you wanted? Is it still important to publish your work? And the results of psychological research are peer-reviewed and made public. That's another idea that's important to mention, is that when we provide those results, that it's peer-reviewed and shared with everybody. And the peer review process is other experts analyze the study's qualities and flaws. And within a journal, a peer article containing peer-reviewed writing on specific academic disciplines is written for that scholarly audience. So these are just like some examples of the publishing process. What other fields study human behavior? Think about that maybe throughout your high school experience and your college experience, you're looking at human behavior in different domains. So what other fields might see that? And how does that field interact with psychology? So let's just talk about developing a study. So as as experts in psychology, they're always asking questions, and that's one of the reasons why I love psychology, is I just feel like I'm a pretty curious person, and I just love asking questions and wondering about things. And sometimes it's just funny to see things that happen in our world and just ask like, why does that happen? You're almost like those comedians that are on stage and they're just like, they bring up some kind of situation or funny observation about the world. That's basically what comedy is bringing up funny things that happen in the world. And so you bring up those questions, but researchers push it further because they have to develop a potential theory. And so with this example, the theory is depression is the result of a combination of biological, psychological, and social factors. So that's my theory. And some brainstorming things we could do is forming a hypothesis of this theory that we could test. So how do we do that? And how do we translate the hypothesis into a testable research question? How do we collect data, which is our method, and how might the results impact our theory? So if we gather our results, we're able to find a way to test our research question. How does it come back to impact our theory? So the next part of this presentation is understanding variables. When we are developing our study and thinking about our research questions, we have to think about what variables will be the most important to consider within our gathering of information and research. So variables are something of interest that varies from person to person or from situation to situation. And we have to have at least two levels that be continuous to look at when we're looking at variables. So just take a look at this photo and name some potential variables that we see. So, and just to remind you again, variables are things that vary from person to person or situation to situation. So one thing you could have noticed is maybe the characteristics between the people, the physical characteristics. So people vary, and so they could vary in height and age, emotion, and other dimensions. For situation, we could think about maybe different ethnicities, different backgrounds when it comes to like maybe where they're from, like what hometown, where they're born or something like that. That could be differences. And there also could be variables when it comes to experience or disorder or mental state. So there could be differences there, things we cannot actually observe in the picture. I mentioned what kind of things can we see, but another way of thinking of it too is maybe you thought about, okay, internally, what are the differences between the individuals when it comes to internal and mental state. So there's two types of variables to think about, at least for now, is measured variables versus manipulated variables. And measured variables are things that we can simply just record, and there's at least one in every study, just things that we're measuring. And then our manipulated variables are things that we can change and what the researcher can control. And I'll talk about that. So it says variable whose values the researcher controls, and I'll talk about the control versus the experimental group. And so researchers assign different participants to different levels of that variable. Those things can vary based on what we're looking at. Some variables can be measured or manipulated, whereas there's some that this can only be measured. And when we're talking about those variables, to test a theory and using the scientific method, researchers have to convert those concepts into concrete, quantifiable, and measurable variables. And for us to do that, we need to create an operational definition. And that's the specific way of measuring or manipulating an abstract variable in a particular study. And the reason why this is important, because I had meant in the previous slide when I was talking about the individuals in the photo could have different mental states. And maybe there's a few or there's a few individuals, or maybe there's one individual who deals with depression. So how are we going to have an operational definition of what depression is? And we have to be able to measure in some way. So we'll talk more about that and some examples, but by establishing the operational definition and what I was just mentioning, maybe an operational definition of what depression is, researchers can operationalize the variables in the study. So operationalizing a variable usually means turning into a number which can be recorded or analyzed. And that variable could be measured variable or manipulated variable. So I had already mentioned one example that could be operational definition, but think about what other terms could be provide an operational definition to. So as you can see here, there's some already on the screen. We have fear, intelligence, sleep quality, mindfulness, health. So what are some ways you can operationally define these? So some things to think about would be the choice of how we operationalize a variable is often made for research, And the simplicity of collecting the data and accuracy of the data is also considered. An example of this would be like if we're studying aggression, we would have to measure it in different ways. And so we could do some kind of self-report or direct observation or some physiological measure. Those would have to be measured in different ways. So let's go to the example that I mentioned before. Just think about like how would we operationalize depression? Thinking about our different methods, what kind of things could we do? And like I had mentioned, we can use self-reports, physiological measures, or a combination to generate some theories on what really depression is. So think about how you would operationalize it. Okay, so let's talk about types of research. There's three different types of research that we could talk about. The first one is descriptive, and then we'll talk about correlational, and then we'll talk about experimental. So these are different types of research. So descriptive research is about observing or describing behavior, and it involves measuring one variable at a time to produce a frequency of distribution or how often something is happening. So this type of research is often what you see in the news when reports mention statistics like the amount of Americans who believe that that UFOs are real or something like that. I just made that up. But it's a lot of it is based off of frequency of like how often or how many people or what percentage of people. And this involves self-report. You see a lot of descriptive research when it comes to politics, where there's probably surveys that are pushed out to different groups of people. Who would you vote for? How do you feel about this candidate or something like that? And that's an example of descriptive research. I just mentioned like a survey can be descriptive. So sample would be people who participate in research and belong to a certain population of interest. And then what is population of interest? It's a full group of people the researcher is trying to understand. So sample is a group of people that who participate in the research, and the population of interest is the whole entire group we want to know more about. So sampling is really important in descriptive research, and there's two primary methods. Random sampling, which tries to reduce bias by giving all members of population an equal chance of being selected. And then there's bias sampling, which is something we don't want to do. And it inadvertently focuses on a non-representative group of the individuals. So not necessarily the group of individuals we want to see in general to be in the study. So we have to be careful about that. And random sampling involves selecting people who serve in our sample without that bias. So what are the kinds of descriptive research are there? There's observational research, where psychologists measure the variable of interest by observing and recording what people are doing. So that could be just like observing animals, like Jane Goodall, observing primates. But it also could mean like a teacher in a classroom. Like I've done observations where I go into a classroom and I'll observe a student or observe the performance of a teacher. And it can be naturalistic, so it could just be like what is happening in the environment. It could be anything that's happening in the environment that you're looking at for that particular individual or group, just like just kind of recording what is happening. And there's also case studies which are more in depth and where a researcher will study one or two individuals in depth, often that have some kind of unique condition or situation. So these findings don't necessarily generalize to a larger population, but they can give us some different insights about certain situations, and inspire some research that we want to go into further. Okay, let's move on to correlational research. So this is another fundamental research method in psychology, and this involves measuring two or more variables in the same sample and observing the relationship between each other. And let's talk about that. Let's talk about like different variables. So in this example, we have generosity versus social class. So this might be something you had seen in your reading, but if you're looking at where you are, certain social classes, whether there's an influence of if you are from a higher social class or more wealthy, will you be less generous? Or if you come from a lower social class or not as wealthy, then will you provide more generosity? You'll read more about that in your text. But if we look at this information, you can see that they had measured these variables between each other, and we can use the data to find the relationship between both. And as you can see, like I just talked about, our social classes on the x-axis as opposed to generosity, which is on the y-axis, which is our vertical line. And each individual in the study is represented by one of those yellow dots. So take a look at the data, see if there's anything interesting that you see. So if we're looking for correlations between different variables, we're going to look at the data and how it looks within our visualization or our graph or scatter plot in that example in the last slide. So you might have seen some patterns, or maybe not. Sometimes that's a possibility. Sometimes the data that is visualized doesn't really show anything. So we might have to do some different kinds of analysis. But anyway, there's some ways we can look at the data and the degree of the correlation. So you can see here, we can have a strong positive correlation. So the data set might trend upwards, as you can see that. There could be a strong negative relationship. And that's when we have the pattern of dots kind of going down. And then there could be a weak relationship. That's when those dots or the data is kind of spread out, but looking like it trends upwards. And then there could be a moderate negative relationship where those dots are kind of spread out, more variable. There could be none, like I mentioned. Sometimes there's just no pattern. So we might have to do some different kinds of analysis to find that. And there's also the weak negative, kind of going cross back and forth here. But I'm sure you get the idea. So just to go back over it again, positive is one value of a variable that increases or decreases. So does the value of the other variable. And then the negative is as the value of one variable decreases or increases, the value of the other variable does the opposite. And the strength of correlation could be determined by the distance from the line, the distance from that slope line. And if there's no correlation, there could be just kind of dots kind of spread all over the place. So can a correlation be strong enough to say that one variable caused the other to occur? So is that possible? Just something to think about. And this could be something that it says no. This could be something that you have heard before, that just because something is correlated doesn't mean that it causes the other variable. So correlation is not causation. So three criteria must be met to conclude that causation. The two variables must be correlated, so they have to show that strength of that trend where I was talking about in the scatter plot. One variable must precede the other because there could be a situation where we're looking at both generation and we're looking at both generosity and social class. But we have to be careful, like, to make sure that one didn't come before the other. We have to think about the temporal relationship between the two. And if we're going to say that one is going to impact the other, that has to precede it. And there must be no reasonable alternative explanations for pattern of correlation. So you'll hear more about that in the reading, and it provides some really good examples. All right, so the next one we're going to talk about is experimental research. And experimental research is when we manipulate the causal variable and observe its effect. So I mentioned the two variables before. I mentioned generosity and I talked about social class. So this situation is where we can pick one of those variables and try to manipulate in a certain way. And the way that could be determined is by finding an independent variable and a dependent variable. And our independent variable is what is manipulated, what can be changed in an experiment. And our dependent variable is just what's measured in an experiment. So I told you that I'll be talking more about those groups, about control. And control is an experimental method to reduce that third variable problem. I mentioned that sometimes the challenge is that we could have two variables and say that are related to each other, but what if it was some other variable? So if we use a control group, experiments reduce that problem of that third variable being some kind of alternative explanation. And then random assignment is another way that we can do that. So in the reading, it talks about how random method is used to decide whether participants will receive each level of the independent variable. And that's a really important element of the experiment. So once again, just to repeat, random assignment is a way of assigning participants to different groups purely by chance, and this method makes sure that each group will have a similar average to be able to be in one of those groups, either be in the control group or the manipulated experimental group. And it's just an important element of experimental design. So if we were to design our own experiments, we could randomly assign participants to one level of the independent variable. So we have our experimental or treatment group, and in the experiment, the group or condition is proposed causes where some kind of proposed cause is present. And then we also have the control group. So that's an experiment, a group or condition in which the proposed cause is not present. So it's just not there. And then sometimes what happens, and this is something that is looked at a lot, is the placebo condition, is sometimes when an experiment, a group or individual will expect to receive the treatment, but they're exposed only to maybe like this is inert version, which is like not getting whatever treatment is at all, or maybe just a little bit of it, but they still kind of show the effects of it. And then we also measure the dependent variable. So why are experiments special? They hold special status in science because we can establish causality by meeting all the criteria, and so that correlation was established. And then also that I said that temporal precedence, that basically means that one comes before the other, and that's assured through this experimental method, and then reduces the chance of that third variable problem from coming up. And we can manipulate the variables across groups. We can do random assignment to those groups and reduce influence from any other variable through control. So this is just a slide that helps you brainstorm maybe some different ways there could be a causal relationship between. So if you're kind of wondering, okay, what kind of things could we compare? It could be self-esteem and grades in school, social media use and depression, age and memory, romantic rejection and driving ability, job satisfaction and family conflict, extroversion and relationship satisfaction. So, but if we're developing experiments, the first thing we want to do is operationalize each variable. So what does it actually mean? What is self-esteem? Like, what does it mean to have like a lot of self-esteem? And how would we measure grades in school? We'd have to define those things. And then how can we randomly assign people to conditions? If we're doing an experiment, we have to make sure that the full participant group that we have gathered, that full group has an equal chance of being in the manipulated variable group. And the next thing would be think about, are there any ethical concerns that arise in the design of our experiment? So one common situation happens in schools. If they're being studied is what is the ethical considerations or impact that could happen if you're providing some kind of comprehension intervention that could be really beneficial to students. So who's to say that one group gets it and the other group doesn't? So just something to think about, that there's always kind of these situations where we have to think about the ethics of our research and who's getting what. And that's just something to think about as you're going through the experimental research process.